Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to Shaping Tomorrow. I'm Shafiq Burhanuddin, Senior Research Officer at IKIM. And in this episode of Shaping Tomorrow, we're very privileged to have with us a distinguished guest who needs no introduction. He is Dato Dr. Afifi Al-Akiti. Assalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you indeed for the invitation. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Now, you're here for, I suppose, for many reasons, but one of the highlights of your presence here is being involved in this Malaysia's International Halal Showcase, MIHAS. You have spoken at the World Halal Conference in particular. Can you perhaps share with us, your observations, your reflections of being involved in this halal industry, among many other involvement of yours in the Muslim world? How do you view the halal industry to begin with? Sure.
Okay. They flew me all the way from Oxford to speak about halal, and I think when we talk about halal, it's important for us to understand the philosophy of halal, particularly for Muslims, and not just for Muslims, but for non-Muslims as well, of course. Now, I believe that the philosophy of halal should go beyond merely the preparation of meat. Right? Many Muslims certainly take for granted that halal is only about making sure that our meat is halal. And although that is important, the preparation of meat is the original reason, the raison d'etre behind why we have the halal industry in the first place. It should also go beyond, in fact, the philosophy of halal governing our consumption, governing our behavior, and governing our lifestyle. In fact, I would argue that the philosophy of halal should be also about an ethical and wholesome way of doing business. And I think that's an important point. It is something that I spoke about at this year's World Halal Conference. And this is particularly important because we should not think of halal simply in the narrow sense of simply the slaughtering of the chicken, but it is more about indeed an ethical and wholesome way of doing business. So I think in this regard, back in 2011 at the very same platform of the World Halal Conference, they talked about the importance of the halal economy. And in that respect, Bank Negara Malaysia, the Malaysia Central Bank, through its Islamic Financial Center in 2014, came up with a very important report entitled The Halal Economy. And in that report, our central bank essentially had made a clarion call, to champion particularly a holistic end-to-end Sharia compliance culture in the halal industry, ensuring not only the production of halal products, services, and goods, but also to ensure a Sharia business and financial model in all of its transactions and its dealings. So, in essence, to start up basically a halal ecosystem there. So I think it's important. I think following the philosophy of halal, if we understand the meaning of halal to mean beyond just simply the slaughtering of meat, it should also be about an ethical and wholesome way of doing business.
Yes. This is very refreshing indeed, Dr. Afifi. I think for longest time, we only hear or observe the halal industry I think only in the mechanistic sense, very superficial, I think, some of the criticism towards it. But I think when you speak about the philosophy of halal, this is something indeed very refreshing. I think it will strengthen the whole look and the substance of the halal industry. So would you say that this one of this issue about that the halal industry is mere commercialization of a very important ethical legal concept in Islam is no longer perhaps a work in progress, it's no longer a real issue?
Well, it's certainly work in progress, and in fact I would say that if we want to go beyond the mechanics of halal, And even when you now introduce the idea here just now in this interview, the commercialization of it, I mean, there's no question of the fact that it's important. It's an important business, the halal industry. The halal industry today stands at $6.5 trillion globally. And that is accounting for the Muslim population today at 1.85 billion, which amounts to almost a quarter of the world's population. That's almost 25% of the world's population. And if the demographers are to be believed, by the year 2030, we're looking at an increase of the Muslim population to 2.2 billion people in the world. So there is no question of the fact that, particularly for the halal industry, as far as the businesses are concerned, that this will be an area of growth. And one should support, of course, initiatives and particularly businesses in growing the halal industry. But as I said earlier, if we understand the philosophy of halal to be beyond simply just the mechanics of the slaughtering, beyond simply, for instance, that, then we need to certainly look at the commercial aspects of it. So on that front, it's interesting that while we should be proud of the fact that the Islamic finance industry has done quite well, and while we indeed have witnessed a great success and stories of success in the Islamic finance industry, story particularly for Malaysia, because Malaysia is certainly a leading country, in that regard, it is striking, however, that the Islamic trade finance or Sharia-compliant trade finance represents only a very small, if not minority, proportion of the global trade finance figures. In fact, it accounts for only 1.5%, according to data back in 2016. So there is a lot of area of growth there. And this is one of the important bits, if we listen to what Bank Negara is saying, that we need to essentially integrate the halal industry with Islamic finance. Can you imagine it? You have halal butchers basically not essentially having their companies funded through Islamic ways, basically non-ribawi ways, ways that are non-riba. So at least that's the next step. So first, going beyond the mechanization of the whole process of halal, we look at the commercialization of it. So even when it comes to the commercialization of it, it is important that we need to make sure that at least it is done in a Sharia compliant way. And that's very, very important. But going beyond that, going beyond the commercialization of the halal industry, as I said earlier, we should also see this as an ethical and wholesome way of life. It's, it should be part of an ethical and wholesome way of doing business. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala famously declares in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 168, Ya ayyuhan nas, right? O mankind, not just Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, not just O you who believe. So Allah is not addressing just the Muslims here. Allah is in fact one of the few verses in the Quran, only a few you can count with your fingers, when the Quran actually addresses, indeed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses all of mankind, both Muslims and non-Muslims, right? Ya ayyuhan nas, kulu mimma fil ard, eat or consume from whatever is on earth, ḥalālan-ṭayyiban, that which is halal, that which is lawful, that which is Sharia compliant, and tayyib, right? And wholesome, and what is perfection, and what is of excellence as well. And what is the meaning of tayyib here, right? What is the meaning of tayyib? There is precisely what I talked about, the philosophy of halal here, that needs to go beyond what is zahir. It needs to go beyond what is the material here. It needs to go beyond simply that, but looking at the commercialization aspect of it as well. So that in the process of commercializing it, we need to make sure that, halal companies make use of halal finance, basically. Halal companies make use of Islamic finance. At the moment, not all are doing this. Some major multinational companies out there, and they come up with halal products, for example, they don't use non-ribawi finance. They don't use Islamic finance, particularly for trade finance, and we can see the growth for that. But going beyond that, there is a wider world, there is a wider world of what we consider to be the right way of living, a sustainable way of living, and this can be encapsulated by, particularly from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the famous UN SDGs, the 17 SDGs. So we could say that, in fact, halal way of life, indeed, the halal philosophy here should really, indeed, encapsulate that.
But Doctor, would you say that the existing practice corresponds with the philosophy that you speak of here, and but indeed we understand that it is a work in progress, as you say. But what are the perhaps areas of improvement, or what kind of talents perhaps we need to ensure that the practice corresponds with the philosophy?
Right. Well, I think I've just now, and let's look at this philosophy of halal in light of the UN SDGs, for example, right? I would come up with my sort of 7 golden rules to establish a halal ecosystem in all of its end-to-end, Sharia compliant way, right? So if we look at the philosophy of halal to be going beyond what is just about slaughtering the halal chicken, then rule number 1, right, would be that we need to make sure and to ensure that the companies and the businesses dealing in the halal industry, should be funded through the Islamic way, and that is using either sukuk financing or Islamic trade finance. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2. That the companies and the businesses, dealing with the halal industry should make sure that they treat their employers fairly. This is, again, it's beyond halal. It's the tayyib aspects here, right? So we are talking about the tayyib aspects here. It's not simply what is lawful, but what is good, what is right, what is ethical in this case. And you cannot have a situation in which you, i.e. the company, oppresses your employers and make sure that they are paid, they are giving a proper, good living wage at the very least. Rule number 3, and this is the focus of the halal industry, of course, the chicken, the meat in question. I mean, the so-called commodity in question. Let's say in this case the halal chicken, the chicken. Well, the chicken then should be farmed in a sustainable way. And what that means is that it should be farmed in an environmentally friendly way. And this is the Islamic way again of doing things. It's not just about halal, but tayyib as well, right? And in rule number 3, we see sometimes, unfortunately, people doing chicken farming, they don't, they put the chicken all in one small, narrow area in order for you to save costs and so on and so forth. So we see some of the disadvantages there. So they're not really properly doing it in an ethical way. And it's important, therefore, that when they understand the philosophy of halal, they understand that it should be farmed in a sustainable way. So in this respect, pursuing a halal way of life is, in fact, you have a win-win proposition. You're also fulfilling the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in that case. Rule number 4, that when you then slaughter the chicken, which is the whole point of the halal industry here, the slaughtering act, which is the rule number 4, not only that, of course, that when you slaughter the dhabiha, should be done in a halal way, of course, Sharia compliant way, in the same way that in the Jewish tradition, they have the kosher, for example, we share very similar ways of doing things in that respect. But then we need to make sure that the animals are treated in an ethical way as well. We need to make sure that the place is done in a hygienic place. We sometimes hear horror stories about where the halal butchers, for example, are very dirty. So again, the spirit is not there. So rule number 4, that the slaughtering must be done correctly and ethically with good conduct. Rule number 5, once we now have the halal meat, it should be packaged, in a way that is sustainable, which means you should be using recyclable packaging, right? Rule number 6, and then when you transport the halal meat, right, the transportation should be done with due consideration of the damage caused by carbon emissions. So that's really when you can say this is ḥalāl-ṭayyib. And finally, rule number 7, where you have from the farm to the table. Right, from the farm to the table in that end-to-end chain in that halal ecosystem. So we need to make sure that the companies and the businesses selling the halal meat, to the retailers and to the consumers, that the prices and the price is at fair value for all concerned in that transaction. So, Shafiq, you see, if we therefore truly understand the meaning of halal and the philosophy of halal, mashallah, through the words of, indeed, the firman and the verse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? O mankind, consume from whatever is on earth, that which is halal, that which is lawful, but not only just that which is halal, but also tayyib, that which is wholesome, right? وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, and do not follow in the footsteps of the devil. إِنَّهُ لَكُمْ عَدُوٌ مُبِينٌ, for he, i.e. the devil, is clearly your enemy to all of you, to all of mankind. So if we really follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command here indeed direction here, then we kill two birds with one stone, both the halal way of living, and also we are able to kind of deal with the issues of, currently of concern in the world today. And we as, Muslims in the Muslim Ummah can contribute to the human capital of trying to resolve some of the world's problems by trying to fulfill, indeed, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 SDGs, through a halal way of living there.
Thank you, Doctor. It's very enlightening indeed. But just a prior question before we go to your very interesting proposition about the need for Islamic finance to be properly integrated into this whole industry. Would you say that educationally speaking, intellectually speaking, we have the groundwork, the ecosystem, such that this very integrated outlook of halal and ṭayyib and practices will be in place? Would you say that we had in our universities, and the institutions in place right now in the government, etc.? Would you say that the people are really prepared to realize the 7 rules that you just mentioned?
Yeah, I think probably not yet, and I think certainly there is a gap there, and this is where both government from the top needs to play its role, and people and the businesses from the ground also need to play their role.
So would you say, for instance, there needs to be more investments in this kind of R&D, for instance, this kind of more investments in scholarships for graduates and students to look more into this theoretical, philosophical matters?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think we should be too theoretical and too philosophical about it. The philosophy is very clear and very simple in the way that I've outlined it. I don't think, more needs to be said about it. I think you need to al-ilm bil-amal. Once you have knowledge of it, you just have to implement and act on it. And the problem is one of implementation, and the problem is one of action. So, for instance, I give you the example of Islamic trade finance just now, which is a very simple, practical example. If only 1.5% of the global proportion of trade finance has been utilized only from the Islamic side, we mean halal finance or Sharia financing for the service of the halal industry. So I think from that point of view, we'll need to do a lot more on that. So, for instance, what could be done from the top would be, the government will need to look at possibly changing some policies, including looking at tax incentives, for example, for the banks to be able to kind of, offer this so that the multinational companies dealing with halal products, for example, could get certain tax breaks, for instance. There could be, for example, another policy that, we should be looking at, perhaps the famous IKIM halal logo, certification. You should consider doing, going beyond the halal logo, perhaps a halal plus or ḥalāl-ṭayyib certification that could be given out to companies who not only engage, of course, with the halal meat, but also use Islamic trade finance, for instance. And these are the bits that are, that needs to be looked at alongside, so that it's a process. I mean, it's not something that can be done overnight. Of course, the 7 steps that I mentioned, the 7 rules or the 7 procedures there to set up a halal ecosystem, an end-to-end Sharia compliant chain, and indeed an end-to-end halal and tayyib basically chain. And I think everything has to come in together there. So as far as the knowledge bits are concerned, it's already pretty clear. But it's the reminder, it's the tafkira, it's the mobilizing bit. That is probably where I think if any investment that should go in should really go into the public perception bit.
So you're saying, as far as the teaching of the religious sciences in the modern universities is concerned, I mean it's fine there. I mean, would you say there requires further improvement so that it's able to contribute more effectively?
Yeah, I think if the teaching is too focused on just the mechanics of halal and not the spirit of it, for sure you need to put more investment to get people to see the substance and the spirit behind why we want to have a halal living, for instance, for sure. But I think it's, like I said, the tradition, our Islamic tradition is very clear about that. So you really need teachers, ustadh, professors, and propagators, basically, who spread that message, essentially.
Right. Very interesting. Now, I think, Dr. Afifi, we have a bit more time to perhaps to extend the conversation, if you don't mind, to perhaps
maybe some of the problems of the halal industry beyond the ones that you actually started off.
What are the biggest challenges? Yeah.
I think some of the bigger challenges. I would classify this into two areas. One, I think, is the problem of what I call halal phobia. Right. So. And it's interesting that because I think halal phobia, is a species, indeed a subspecies of Islamophobia. And an example of Islamophobia that has happened, of course, in the last few weeks, of course, was the tragedy of what had happened, for example, in New Zealand, in Christchurch, for instance. Now that is an extreme example, right, in Islamophobia. But halal phobia is basically a species of that, and I can give you an example. Back in December 2017, the French in France, the French government basically has now, they have certain reactionary policies against halal living, which is rather unfortunate. So there was one of the courts there closed a halal supermarket for not selling pork or alcohol. Now this is in view of the country's own very strict secular philosophy called laicity, right? Laicism. Yes. So we can agree to disagree on that, but nevertheless, that is a negative, I think, a negative development for the halal industry. So while we should be proud of the proliferation, of Islamic brands in the global market today, we should also ask seriously the question, to what extent do we want to segment the halal market along identity and religious lines? And that is a serious question to ask, and that's a very important question to ask. Now, why I say this is also because of what has happened in France. Of course, is an example where we need to be aware of the challenges, of course, in the halal industry. On the good news side of it, of course, even in non-Muslim majority countries, like in the United Kingdom in particular, where, of course, I'm based in Oxford and I teach there and I live in the United Kingdom, in England. There, in the United Kingdom, 20% of the sheep meat industry, for example, is consumed by Muslims. And the number, of course, is indeed growing. Yeah. And there is already now international collaboration between Malaysia and the United Kingdom. So, for example, one of the state halal agencies in Malaysia has a collaboration with a Northeast English Council in a joint venture in the halal industry. So this is a very positive example of building bridges between a Muslim, Muslim majority country like Malaysia and a non-Muslim majority country like the United Kingdom, elicited and indeed caused by the halal industry. But because of what had happened, of course, in France, I think it's important for us to really ask this question about to what extent do the halal market should be segmented along simply just religious and identity lines. That's why I think we need to strike a delicate balance between, on the one hand, the availability of halal products and services for Muslims worldwide, and on the other hand, the balance must also be achieved to encourage non-Muslims themselves, non-Muslims, to see halal as a viable option for themselves as well. So I think this is the balance that we Muslims must learn to manage. So this is the first challenge, the challenge of halal phobia.
Okay.
I hope that Malaysia, being one of the countries at the forefront of the halal industry and certainly sees itself as the wanting to be the global hub for halal, should really be aware of this and not be naive of that. Secondly, I think it's the challenge of what I consider to be the internationalizing the halal industry in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, the so-called IR 4.0. And why do I bring this up? IR 4.0, and why link that with the internationalizing the halal industry is a challenge, because people will think, oh, this is a good thing. Well, past industrial revolutions have seen, and for those of our listeners who do not know about any of the industrial revolutions, of course we have 4 industrial revolutions so far. The first industrial revolution is sometimes called the mechanical revolution, the mechanical industrial revolution, when the steam engines were invented. You have the railroad, you have the trains, and the second industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution was from the 18th to the 19th century, and the second industrial revolution from 1875 or 1895 to the First World War, which is sometimes considered to be the IR 2.0, the electrical revolution or the mass production revolution. It's when you have people like Henry Ford and Thomas Edison who invented the light bulb, for instance. And the third industrial revolution is what some ulama and scholars and academics call the computing revolution, really, from the 60s, 70s, and indeed particularly in the 70s onwards. So what are the distinctive features of all these industrial revolutions? They change the way people live. They disrupt the way people live. And past industrial revolutions have shown us that if businesses and the industry itself does not adapt to new technologies, the technology brought about by the new industrial revolution, then they will be struggling, or they will even be in danger of failing. Right? So this is where now the halal industry needs to be aware of the fact that they are now in this new so-called fourth industrial revolution age, which is what? The fourth industrial revolution is really about, some ulama and some scholars say, it's the digital revolution. It's the, revolution set about by people, by Mark Zuckerberg, by Facebook, by social media, and so on and so forth, i.e. the world of the apps, right? The world of the Internet of Things. So what can be done in this case? What can be done in this case? Well, a very simple example would be the halal certification done by IKIM, right? This is a very famous logo all over the world. People do recognize this, and sometimes people say it's overhyped as well, I'm sure. But nevertheless, one can improve this by making sure, and one integrates the fourth industrial revolution's technology into this whole process by utilizing the latest blockchain technology to do the halal certification process. Right. And that's important, because then that will cut down the time for people to get the halal certificates. This is one of the major complaints. We hear the good news. Brilliant, alhamdulillah, the halal logo of IKIM known worldwide. Although there are other halal logos out there as well. IKIM is not alone. So one day, our Malaysian halal logo can be, at the moment we are in pole position, we are in number 1 position, but if we don't keep our eye on the ball, we could be number 2, number 3, number 4. We could fall down the rankings if we are not careful. So one way to keep us ahead is to make use of this latest technology, blockchain technology, to ensure that the process of getting a halal certificate is transparent, that there is no corruption there involved in this process, that it is done speedily, so rather than waiting for a year to get a certificate or 6 months, that hopefully it could be done in less than time, whether in a few weeks or so and so forth. So those are the 2 challenges that I see in the halal industry. The first challenge, the problem of halal phobia. Thanks, of course, to the great success stories of the halal industry, the growth even in non-Muslim majority countries, we now have a slight reaction there. So we need to think about how we market, how we brand halal products. Is it simply just a religious obligation? Well, I've already given you an example where it could be tied in with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's not simply just a religious obligation. It could be an ethical way of doing business there. And secondly, the problem of the internationalizing the halal industry in the age of the fourth industrial revolution, IR 4.0. We can make use of the latest trends, alhamdulillah, from that latest technology in pursuit of our religion and in pursuit of our spiritual life.
Doctor, pertaining to the first challenge that you were mentioning about the question whether the extent of wanting to segment our products and services along simply religious lines and religious and identity lines, are you suggesting perhaps that it shouldn't be so much about the appearance of it, but more about the substance?
That's right. That's right. Exactly. So Imam Al-Ghazali, radiyallahu anhu, may Allah be very well pleased with him. In fact, famously in one of his famous maxims said, إِذَا عُرِفَ الْمَعْنَى فَلَا مُشَاهَةَ فِي الْأَسَامِي. This is the perennial problem that sometimes Muslim faced with, the problem of substance over form or form over substance. Of course, once the substance, once the meaning, once the essence is understood, then there is no need to fight and quarrel and over the label and the name of that thing. So I think clearly, we need to make sure that rule number 4, that the chicken is slaughtered in a halal way, right? But beyond that, we can see that 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 are all things that we can then package in such a way that, in fact, this halal product is also viable for non-Muslims as well. And so they see this less as an identity issue. They see this less as a sustainable way of living. In fact, that's the halal way of living. This is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses mankind. Ya ayyuhan nas kulu mimma fil ard ḥalāl-ṭayyiban. To all mankind, consume from whatever is on earth that which is lawful, and not just lawful, but that which is also tayyib, that which is also wholesome, that which is also ethical, that which is also, the perfect way of living. And reminding ourselves of Imam Al-Ghazali here as well. He reminds us of the distinction between, if you like, halal and tayyib, or the distinction between, what is halal and ihsan. What is the minimum rule and what is the peak of perfection. Imam Al-Ghazali gives us an image of a mountain like the Mount Everest, right? The peak of Mount Everest is perfection, right? Zurwa, Imam Al-Ghazali calls it. But when we, so you start from a position of halal, what is the minimum rule here that we need to make sure it is in fact lawful? Then you try and scale the peak of perfection. But even if you fall from the peak of tayyib, the peak of perfection here, there is no sin. So you try your best. You need to cover what is halal. If you breach the halal, of course it becomes haram. There is sin. But beyond that, it's ihsan. Beyond that, it's tayyib. So if you fall from not being able to do what is tayyib, there is still no sin. But we must still put that as part of our, of course, aspiration to make sure that we are able to be living in a sustainably there.
Okay, before we conclude, Doctor, just more about the kind of role perhaps institutions like IKIM as a think tank, and perhaps scholars in our country. Perhaps what would you suggest? I mean, how we can perhaps bridge the gap such that we can realize these aspirations that you speak of.
Well, I think for the listeners, particularly those not from Malaysia, in the international scene might not know what is IKIM. IKIM stands for Institute Kefahaman Islam Malaysia, the Institute of the Islamic Understanding of Malaysia. So by the very name of IKIM means that you're supposed to be the institution that ought to dispel misconceptions about Islam. We live in an age where people condemn the things they don't understand. And, Imam Al-Ghazali again, says, An-nasu a'da'u ma jahilu. People or mankind are enemies of what they are ignorant of. Echoing what the great Roman philosopher and orator Cicero said, damnan quod non intelligent. People condemn the things they don't understand. So the role of IKIM here is to actually make people understand so that they don't condemn the things they don't understand. And because of this, IKIM, if I can say this, or IKIM, or IKIM, or the Institute of Islamic Understanding of Malaysia, or Institute Kefahaman Islam Malaysia, duty and role is to dispel Islamophobia. Because that's the whole point of the raison d'etre of IKIM, if you ask me.
Sure.
Because if you're able to provide the true meaning of Islam to the world at large, not only just in Malaysia, then you will be able to, inshallah, be a small bulwark against the tide of Islamophobia that is, of course, affecting the world today, that we see sadly crystallizing in Christchurch and New Zealand. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been on Shaping Tomorrow with our distinguished guest, Dato Dr. Afifi Al-Akiti. Thank you once again, Dato. With that, wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Wassalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi.